Before we jump into Chapter 24 of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, I'd like to make fun of a few people. I seem to remember making fun of Chauncey De Vega in a previous show. I think I mentioned one of his articles in passing. It wasn't the main focus of that show. All I remember is that I think it was well written, but he seemed to be a little off. I've been searching for it and I just can't find it anywhere. If you find it, let me know please in the comments or something. Or send me a message on Facebook. It's possible that I was making fun of him for having Trump derangement syndrome. Anyway, this lovely piece is called Unity with Trumpers? It's a Trap! If I did make fun of him before for having Trump derangement syndrome, this is proof that it was well founded. Donald Trump, now the former president of the United States, was and is many things. An authoritarian and fascist and a demagogue. And just so you know, Chauncey, we've established all of those things before, so you're right about that. An abusive parent or spouse on a societal scale who delights in tormenting the American people. A destroyer, a person who encourages the worst of human behavior, pathological, an apparent sociopath or psychopath, evil, corrupt, and enraptured with violence, a white supremacist, the worst president in American history, a traitor. Now, it's interesting because I agree that all those things are true about Donald Trump. And the sad part is, even so, he's not the worst president in American history by a long shot. In my view, because of his cabinet especially, Joe Biden is shaping up to be the worst president in American history. And Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush are not far behind. Ronald Reagan also, for reasons we've outlined many times in this show, is a candidate. So if you can say all these things about Donald Trump without acknowledging our horrible, sordid history of neoliberalism, then I would perhaps nominate you as a candidate for being a shitlib. Let's keep going and see if you deserve it. The American people held their breath in fear and anticipation of the horrible things that would and did come to pass in the final days of Trump's regime. When Joe Biden became president of the United States at 12 noon on Wednesday, they could finally let out a sigh of relief. While many in the news media have celebrated Joe Biden's election and now presidency as averting or reversing catastrophe, that is not in fact true. Donald Trump inflicted numerous catastrophes on the United States, ramped up authoritarianism, fascism, and overt white supremacy, a coup attempt, a lethal plague. Yeah, you can blame a lot of the problems of the lethal plague on him, but don't forget Nancy Pelosi. Collective post-traumatic disorder, probably true. Economic ruin. I apologize for all the ads on this page. Raw story is pretty shitty. Biden's inauguration speech showed that he may in fact be more than a transitional president whose job is to tend a broken democracy. Okay, Chauncey. As long as you're not saying that Trump is the reason the democracy is broken, or that Trump alone is the reason that democracy is broken. So let me start that sentence over. Biden's inauguration speech showed that he may in fact be more than a transitional president whose job it is to tend a broken democracy, government, and country by doing the bare minimum and leaving it all somewhat better than he found it. Considering the challenges the United States faces from its many self-inflicted wounds, a return to normal may actually be an accomplishment in itself. What would you say normal is, Chauncey? Shitlibs would say it's a state of affairs where they can comfortably go back to brunch. Is that what you're saying? Biden's inauguration speech was Lincoln-esque. Uh-oh. I'm going to read to you in a little bit, Chauncey, a part of a chapter of a book by Howard Zinn, and you're going to see that people who worship Lincoln are still waiting for a savior to rescue them. Skipping ahead. Whatever one may think of Biden as a politician, he has shown himself to be a decent and honorable man. Not a racist rapist then, Chauncey? As the successor to a president who had no such qualities, Biden's humanity is one of his greatest strengths. This is especially true for a country and a people who are mired in death and loss, not just literally in the form of lives lost and ruined, but also in that Trumpism has rendered the United States almost into an undead country, unsure and lost, whose stories and myths about its own greatness and inherent goodness have been exposed as lies. Really, undead, unsure and lost. And all that because of Donald Trump. I would say that Trumpism is a bigger problem than just Trump. Trumpism is people waiting for the hope and change Obama promised and not getting it. That's what Trumpism is. Get a load of this. But Biden's humanity and fundamental decency and generosity of spirit could also prove to be his greatest weakness. Yeah, that fundamental decency and generosity of spirit that led to him to continually try to cut Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. What a generous guy. Same generosity that led him to author the crime bill and try to incarcerate people. What Chauncey doesn't like is that President Biden wants the tens of millions of Trump's political cult to join the rest of normal society. Gosh, we can't have that basket of deplorables, can we, Chauncey? Again, I don't know if Chauncey knows any actual Republicans. I would say, on average, the typical Republican is a hell of a lot more decent than Joe Biden. And you seem to be missing the point that many Trump supporters didn't support him because he was racist, and they aren't racist necessarily. It's a Hillary Clinton move to lump all Trump supporters into one category and say they're all racist bigots. I'd say you'd have to know a lot more people who voted for Donald Trump to make that generalization. Otherwise, you just swill the corporate media and you believe what they tell you to believe. Oh, wait! You're the corporate media telling me what you think I should believe. That everyone who voted for Donald Trump is part of a political cult and they're all racist bigots. As opposed to thinking that many of them voted for Trump because they wanted a better economic deal than the Democrats were giving them. Of course, Trump was a charlatan. Of course, they shouldn't have believed him. But the fact that they didn't trust the Democrats to give them what they needed doesn't mean they think Trump was a good person. A lot of people who voted for Trump voted for him because he was the lesser evil. Now, my viewers and listeners know I don't believe in voting for the lesser evil, but I can see that a lot of Trump voters did. If I had voted for the lesser of two evils instead of for the Green Party, that's probably what I would have done. But as I said, I don't do that. I don't vote for either racist rapist. Let me jump to his stirring conclusion because, frankly, he's not worth more time than that. Joe Biden has declared himself a president for all Americans. In practice, however, that may be impossible. Instead, Biden needs to realize sooner rather than later that he must be the best president possible while refusing to surrender to the demands of a Republican Party and right-wing public that views him and his voters as illegitimate and un-American. And again, I have to remind you that right-wing means that you're against the king. You'll have to go back and watch previous shows because I'm not going to go over all that again. If you're against the king, you're also against the oligarchs. Monarchy, oligarchy are both bad. Left-wing people want democracy. They want what's best for the people. And lots of voters who are, in your view, right-wingers actually want what's best for the people. We the people. They are democratic in their thinking. They just simply can't see the Democrats bringing us to where we need to go. And that's very legitimate. So let me finish that. While refusing to surrender to the demands of a Republican Party and right-wing public that views him and his voters as illegitimate and un-American. But Chauncey, Joe Biden is illegitimate and he is un-American. To me, un-American means pro-corporate. Joe Biden is a corporate tool. To me, that makes him un-American. And then he calls Donald Trump supporters such people. To compromise with such people is not a path to national healing. It is a path to the betrayal of American democracy that will only serve to undermine our new president's ability to lead the country back to reality, sanity, health, and perhaps even greatness. Well, Chauncey, if in your book, economic insecurity is what makes this country great, then we're on the right track. All right, Chauncey, I'm going to leave you there and make fun of somebody else. In this case, Ellie Mistel is the person I'm going to skewer. Ellie is in favor of Twitter and Facebook censorship. Her delightful little piece is called "Twitter and Facebook Just Proved That Deplatforming Works." She's making the case that the protests were peaceful on Inauguration Day because social media stepped in. It should make all of us feel really happy that things were so peaceful because, we wouldn't want protesters to be allowed to, protest. Peace is way more important than free speech, right, Ellie? So if you haven't ruled out Salon Magazine, Raw Story, and The Nation by now, you should have. She says delegitimizing people like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Trump works. Inauguration Day proved that. So she thinks it's a great success if people aren't allowed to protest. I wonder how she'd feel if she weren't allowed to protest. And then she says, it's fair to say that putting 25,000 troops on the ground and locking down Washington, D.C. for a week probably played a bigger role in securing the inauguration than temporarily suspending Marjorie Taylor Greene from Twitter. Yeah, that's a good way to run a country. Put 25,000 troops on the ground to make sure that the people aren't allowed to express themselves. And then she says forebodingly, and one can only hope that militarizing the ceremonial functions of government does not become a new normal we all have to endure. What the actual fuck, Ellie? What do you think is going to happen? We need the military and Silicon Valley to clamp down on everyone so that we can have a quiet inauguration day. They've been doing the same thing with the primary nominating conventions. They've got those locked down tight as a drum. The last thing we want is for we the people to be able to express themselves openly in public. Again, I'm going to let you read the rest for yourself, but if you want to know why shitlibs are shitlibbing, it's because of publications like this. We should just name the whole collection of them as the Shitlib Manifesto, the playbook for shitlibbery. Now I'm jumping to a Tomgram to review Danny Shurson peering into a forever war crystal ball. I mentioned Danny yesterday, so I wanted to follow up with this. More than 19 years ago, the U.S. launched the air war that would become the ground invasion and liberation of Afghanistan. What do you think about that, Chauncey? More than 17 years ago, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared major combat over in that country with just 8,000 U.S. troops still stationed there. Approximately 9 years after that, at the end of an Obama-era surge, U.S. troop levels would reach around 100,000, not counting contingents of NATO allies as well as private contractors, CIA agents, and those involved in the American air war in that country. Today, those troop levels are finally down to 2,500, plus, of course, those private contractors and that air power, which actually ramped up significantly in the Trump years. That, in other words, is how Donald Trump ended the American war in Afghanistan. Those remaining troops are supposed to be gone by May 1st, 2021, but don't count on it in the Biden era, since our new president, who as vice president had indeed been against the Obama-era troop surge, is seemingly committed to keeping some kind of counter-terror force in that country. But thank goodness for Joe Biden's basic decency and humanitarianism. In any case, 19 plus years after Washington put everything it had into Afghanistan except nuclear weapons, something Donald Trump threatened to do at one point, the Taliban is the very opposite of defeated. As the PBS NewsHour described the situation in an on-screen note introducing a recent report on developments there, the Taliban is stronger in Afghanistan than at any point since 2001, occupying 1/5 of the country with around 60,000 full-time fighters. Isn't it strange when you think about it that other than some anti-war efforts by veterans of those conflicts, Americans have been so little concerned with nearly 2 decades of constant military failure across the globe for which we've squandered trillions of taxpayer dollars? Worst of all, those forever wars show every sign of continuing in the Biden years and possibly beyond, as former Army officer and Tom Dispatch regular Danny Shurson, author most recently of Patriotic Dissent, America in the Age of Endless War, explains so vividly and painfully today. Shurson, who has been in the past all too accurate in his expectations about American war-making, offers a little crystal ball look at what all of us might expect in the next 4 years from the country that just won't stop fighting and a citizenry that seems as if it could care less. Chauncey, you don't care much about war, do you? That's why you think Biden is such a decent fellow. In case you couldn't tell already, Chauncey, I think you're a shitlib. How do you feel about this little tweet from Pat the Burner? My rent is late, I lost my job, lost my healthcare coverage, and I'm hungry. Dems. No problem, vote blue and we'll help immediately. Like those $2,000 checks that are going to go out the door right away, right, Joe? Right, Chauncey? Done. Now what? Dems. Wait for it. Okay, I've been waiting. What's the plan? Dems. Wait longer. I'm homeless now. Dems. Trump was worse. That's what you'd say, right, Chauncey? Trump was worse. That's what lesser evil voting gets you. And now we jump to chapter 24 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The chapter is called The Coming Revolt of the Guards. If you know me, you know I'm all about a revolution happening, and this chapter gives me some hope. Howard says, the title of this chapter is not a prediction, but a hope which I will soon explain. As for the subtitle of this book, A People's History of the United States, Howard says it is not quite accurate. A people's history promises more than any one person can fulfill, and it is the most difficult kind of history to recapture. I call it that anyway because with all its limitations, it is a history disrespectful of governments and respectful of people's movements of resistance. Well, that's hopeful. That makes it a biased account, one that leans in a certain direction. I am not troubled by that because the mountain of history books under which we all stand leans so heavily in the other direction, so tremblingly respectful of states and statesmen, and so disrespectful by inattention to people's movements that we need some counterforce to avoid being crushed into submission. All those histories of this country centered on the founding fathers and the presidents weigh oppressively on the capacity of the ordinary citizen to act. They suggest that in times of crisis, we must look to someone to save us. In the Revolutionary crisis, the Founding Fathers. In the Slavery crisis, Lincoln. In the Depression, Roosevelt. In the Vietnam Watergate crisis, Carter. And that between occasional crises, everything is all right, and it is sufficient for us to be restored to that normal state. They teach us that the supreme act of citizenship is to choose among saviors by going into a voting booth every 4 years to choose between two white and well-off Anglo-Saxon males of inoffensive personality and orthodox opinions. Yeah. The idea of saviors has been built into the entire culture, beyond politics. We have learned to look to stars, leaders, experts in every field, thus surrendering our own strength, demeaning our own ability, obliterating our own selves. But from time to time, Americans reject that idea and rebel. These rebellions so far have been contained. The American system is the most ingenious system of control in world history. Caitlin Johnstone, you should read this. The American system is the most ingenious system of control in world history. Kate's been telling us this for a long time now. With a country so rich in natural resources, talent, and labor power, the system can afford to distribute just enough wealth to just enough people to limit discontent to a troublesome minority. It is a country so powerful, so big, so pleasing to so many of its citizens that it can afford to give freedom of dissent to the small number who are not pleased. There is no other system of control with more openings, apertures, leeways, flexibilities, rewards for the chosen, winning tickets in lotteries. There is none that disperses its controls more complexly through the voting system, the work situation, the church, the family, the school, the mass media, none more successful in mollifying opposition with reforms, isolating people from one another, creating patriotic loyalty. 1% of the nation owns a third of the wealth. The rest of the wealth is distributed in such a way as to turn those in the 99% against one another. Small property owners against the propertyless, black against white, native-born against foreign-born, intellectuals and professionals against the uneducated and unskilled. These groups have resented one another and warred against one another with such vehemence and violence as to obscure their common position as sharers of leftovers in a very wealthy country. Chauncey isn't going to tell you that. Chauncey would lose his shit because Jimmy Dore was talking about the Boogaloo Boys on his show. What the most enlightened of those on the left seem to realize is that we've been calling the wrong people deplorables. The people who have succumbed to Fox News are no worse or no better than the people who have succumbed to Clinton News Network and MSDNC. We've been tricked into hating each other. I think with the right ideas, we can start to untrick everyone. And people will yell at me and say I'm a Trumpster, or I'm a Trumpin' left, or whatever Paul Street would say, because I believe that the people have more in common than against each other. I believe that if we focus on the economic injustice that this country has faced for the last 40 plus years, more like 70 years really, then we could really start to get things turned around and fixed. We don't need a return to normal when normal has been so exploitative of the working class. If you think we need a return to normal, then you're a shitlib, you're in the brunch crowd, and you just need to shut the fuck up. But instead, you get paid to write bullshit on mainstream media and try to keep us hating each other. That's what Chauncey does. And that's what Ellie Mistel does too. Against the reality of that desperate, bitter battle for resources made scarce by elite control, I am taking the liberty of uniting those 99% as the people. I have been writing a history that attempts to represent their submerged, deflected, common interest. So the person who was asking me in the comments which books would I recommend reading, I'm going to put this one at the top of the list. To emphasize the commonality of the 99%, to declare deep enmity of interest with the 1% is to do exactly what the governments of the United States and the wealthy elite allied to them from the founding fathers to now have tried their best to prevent. Chauncey wants you to blame people who voted for Donald Trump instead of blaming the founding fathers and instead of blaming the corporate elite. Madison feared a majority faction and hoped the new Constitution would control it, and so far it has. He and his colleagues began the preamble to the Constitution with the words, "We the people," pretending that the new government stood for everyone and hoping that this myth, accepted as fact, would ensure domestic tranquility. That's what Ellie wants on Inauguration Day, as opposed to people protesting what is so horribly wrong and out of whack with this country. The pretense continued over the generations, helped by all-embracing symbols, physical or verbal, the flag, patriotism, democracy, national interest, national defense, national security. The slogans were dug into the earth of American culture like a circle of covered wagons on the Western Plain, from inside of which the white, slightly privileged American could shoot to kill the enemy outside, Indians or blacks or foreigners or other whites too wretched to be allowed inside the circle. The managers of the caravan watched at a safe distance, and when the battle was over and the fields strewn with dead on both sides, they would take over the land and prepare another expedition for another territory. The scheme never worked perfectly. The Revolution and the Constitution, trying to bring stability by containing the class angers of the colonial period while enslaving blacks, annihilating or displacing Indians, did not quite succeed, judging by the tenant uprisings, the slave revolts, the abolitionist agitation, the feminist upsurge, the Indian guerrilla warfare of the pre-Civil War years. After the Civil War, a new coalition of Southern and Northern elites developed, with Southern whites and blacks of the lower classes occupied in racial conflict, native workers and immigrant workers clashing in the North, and the farmers dispersed over a big country while the system of capitalism consolidated itself in industry and government. But there came rebellion among industrial workers and a great opposition movement among farmers. At the turn of the century, the violent pacification of blacks and Indians and the use of elections and war to absorb and divert white rebels were not enough. Violent pacification. That seems to be what Ellie Mistel was trying to get. Violent pacification is what happens when Twitter and Facebook are allowed to censor our speech. Let me start that one over. At the turn of the century, the violent pacification of blacks and Indians and the use of elections and war to absorb and divert white rebels were not enough in the conditions of modern industry to prevent the great upsurge of socialism, the massive labor struggles before the First World War. Neither that war, nor the partial prosperity of the 20s, nor the apparent destruction of the socialist movement could prevent, in the situation of economic crisis, another radical awakening, another labor upsurge in the 30s. World War II created a new unity, followed by an apparently successful attempt in the atmosphere of the Cold War to extinguish the strong radical temper of the war years. But then, surprisingly, came the surge of the 60s from people thought long subdued or put out of sight, blacks, women, Native Americans, prisoners, soldiers, and a new radicalism which threatened to spread widely in a population disillusioned by the Vietnam War and the politics of Watergate. The exile of Nixon, the celebration of the bicentennial, the presidency of Carter, all aimed at restoration. But restoration to the old order was no solution to the uncertainty, the alienation, which was intensified in the Reagan-Bush years. See, Chauncey? That's why we need to do better than to go back to normal. The election of Clinton in 1992, carrying with it a vague promise of change, did not fulfill the expectations of the hopeful. With such continuing malaise, it is very important for the establishment, that uneasy club of business executives, generals, and politicos, to maintain the historic pretension of national unity, in which the government represents all the people and the common enemy is overseas, not at home, where disasters of economics or war are unfortunate errors or tragic accidents to be corrected by the members of the same club that brought the disasters. It is important for them also to make sure this artificial unity of highly privileged and slightly privileged is the only unity, that the 99% remain split in countless ways and turn against one another to vent their angers. And that, dear viewers and listeners, are what the corporate media people like Chauncey do for a living. How skillful to tax the middle class to pay for the relief of the poor, building resentment on top of humiliation. How adroit to bust poor black youngsters into poor white neighborhoods in a violent exchange of impoverished schools, while the schools of the rich remain untouched and the wealth of the nation, doled out carefully where children need free milk, is drained for billion-dollar aircraft carriers. How ingenious to meet the demands of blacks and women for equality by giving them small special benefits and setting them in competition with everyone else for jobs made scarce by an irrational, wasteful system. How wise to turn the fear and anger of the majority toward a class of criminals bred by economic inequity faster than they can be put away, deflecting attention from the huge thefts of national resources carried out within the law by men in executive offices. But with all the controls of power and punishment, enticements and concessions, diversions and decoys operating throughout the history of the country, the establishment has been unable to keep itself secure from revolt. There's that word, revolt. I like that word. Every time it looked as if it had succeeded, the very people it thought seduced or subdued stirred and rose. Blacks, cajoled by Supreme Court decisions and congressional statutes, rebelled. Women, wooed and ignored, romanticized and mistreated, rebelled. Indians, thought dead, reappeared, defiant. Young people, despite lures of career and comfort, defected. Working people, thought soothed by reforms, regulated by law, kept within bounds by their own unions, went on strike. Government intellectuals, pledged to secrecy, began giving away secrets. Priests turned from piety to protest. That's not what Ellie wants. She wants a peaceful inauguration. She wants people kept within bounds. And that, my dear union friends, is what the union is really all about. The leaders are there to keep us within bounds. They are controlled opposition, and they're doing a great job all over this wonderful country. To recall this is to remind people of what the establishment would like them to forget. The enormous capacity of apparently helpless people to resist, of apparently contented people to demand change. To uncover such history is to find a powerful human impulse to assert one's humanity. It is to hold out, even in times of deep pessimism, the possibility of surprise. True, to overestimate class consciousness, to exaggerate rebellion and its successes would be misleading. It would not account for the fact that the world, not just the United States, but everywhere else, is still in the hands of the elites, that people's movements, although they show an infinite capacity for recurrence, have so far been either defeated or absorbed or perverted, that socialist revolutionists have betrayed socialism, that nationalist revolutions have led to new dictatorships. But most histories understate revolt, overemphasize statesmanship, and thus encourage impotency among citizens. When we look closely at resistance movements or even at isolated forms of rebellion, we discover that class consciousness or any other awareness of injustice has multiple levels. It has many ways of expression, many ways of revealing itself, open, subtle, direct, distorted. In a system of intimidation and control, people do not show how much they know, how deeply they feel, until their practical sense informs them they can do so without being destroyed. And yes, this is a system of intimidation and control. If you're a media person, you know this. You know that's your job. Intimidation and control in subtle ways. This is me, obviously. You just wait. When the people find that they can no longer contain themselves, they're going to come out of their cages and they're going to start doing shit. And then you're going to see the shit-lipped pundits lose their shit. That's when they'll be less subtle and more controlling. And that's going to help the cause of the revolution more than anything else. Back to the story. History, which keeps alive the memory of people's resistance, suggests new definitions of power. By traditional definitions, whoever possesses military strength, wealth, command of official ideology, cultural control, has power. And that includes education, power over education. Measured by these standards, popular rebellion never looked strong enough to survive. However, the unexpected victories, even temporary ones, of insurgents show the vulnerability of the supposedly powerful. In a highly developed society, the establishment cannot survive without the obedience and loyalty of millions of people who are given small rewards to keep the system going. The soldiers and police, teachers and ministers, administrators and social workers, technicians and production workers, doctors, lawyers, nurses, transport and communications workers, garbage men and firemen. These people, the employed, the somewhat privileged, are drawn into alliance with the elite. They become the guards of the system, buffers between the upper and lower classes. If they stop obeying, the system falls. Dun dun dun. That will happen, I think, only when all of us who are slightly privileged and slightly uneasy begin to see that we are all like the guards in the prison uprising at Attica, expendable, that the establishment, whatever rewards it gives us, will also, if necessary to maintain its control, kill us. That's not hyperbole. That's actual fact. Certain new facts may, in our time, emerge so clearly as to lead to general withdrawal of loyalty from the system. The new conditions of technology, economics, and war in the atomic age make it less and less possible for the guards of the system, the intellectuals, the homeowners, the taxpayers, the skilled workers, the professionals, the servants of government, to remain immune from the violence, physical and psychic, inflicted on the black, the poor, the criminal, the enemy overseas. The internationalization of the economy, the movement of refugees and illegal immigrants across borders, both make it more difficult for the people of the industrial countries to be oblivious to hunger and disease in the poor countries of the world. All of us have become hostages in the new conditions of doomsday technology, runaway economics, global poisoning, uncontainable war. The atomic weapons, the invisible radiations, the economic anarchy do not distinguish prisoners from guards, and those in charge will not be scrupulous in making distinctions. There is the unforgettable response of the U.S. High Command to the news that American prisoners of war might be near Nagasaki. Targets previously assigned for centerboard remain unchanged. There is evidence of growing dissatisfaction among the guards. We have known for some time that the poor and ignored were the non-voters, alienated from a political system they felt didn't care about them and about which they could do little. Now alienation has spread upward into families above the poverty line. These are white workers, neither rich nor poor, but angry over economic insecurity, unhappy with their work, worried about their neighborhoods, hostile to government. Combining elements of racism with elements of class consciousness, contempt for the lower classes along with distrust for the elite, and thus open to solutions from any direction, right or left. Skipping ahead, the most common and most publicized crimes have been the violent crimes of the young, the poor, a virtual terrorization in the big cities in which the desperate or drug-addicted attack and rob the middle class or even their fellow poor. A society so stratified by wealth and education lends itself naturally to envy and class anger. The critical question in our time is whether the middle classes, so long led to believe that the solution for such crimes is more jails and more jail terms, may begin to see, by the sheer uncontrollability of crime, that the only prospect is an endless cycle of crime and punishment. They might then conclude that physical security for a working person in the city can come only when everyone in the city is working, and that would require a transformation of national priorities, a change in the system. In recent decades, the fear of criminal assault has been joined by an even greater fear. Deaths from cancer began to multiply, and medical researchers seemed helpless to find the cause. It began to be evident that more and more of these deaths were coming from an environment poisoned by military experimentation and industrial greed. The water people drank, the air they breathed, the particles of dust from the buildings in which they worked had been quietly contaminated over the years by a system so frantic for growth and profit that the safety and health of human beings had been ignored. A new and deadly scourge appeared, the AIDS virus, which spread with special rapidity among homosexuals and drug addicts. In the early 90s, the false socialism of the Soviet system had failed, and the American system seemed out of control. A runaway capitalism, a runaway technology, a runaway militarism, a running away of government from the people it claimed to represent. Crime was out of control. Cancer and AIDS were out of control. Prices and taxes and unemployment were out of control. The decay of cities and the breakdown of families were out of control, and people seemed to sense all this. Skipping ahead again to an even better part, these struggles would involve all the tactics used at various times in the past by people's movements, demonstrations, marches, civil disobedience, strikes and boycotts and general strikes, direct action to redistribute wealth, to reconstruct institutions, to revamp relationships, creating in music, literature, drama, all the arts and all the areas of work and play and everyday life, a new culture of sharing, of respect, a new joy in the collaboration of people to help themselves and one another. There would be many defeats, but when such a movement took hold in hundreds of thousands of places all over the country, it would be impossible to suppress, because the very guards the system depends on to crush such a movement would be among the rebels. It would be a new kind of revolution, the only kind that could happen, I believe, in a country like the United States. It would take enormous energy, sacrifice, commitment, patience. But because it would be a process over time, starting without delay, there would be the immediate satisfactions that people have always found in the affectionate ties of groups striving together for a common goal. All this takes us far from American history into the realm of imagination, but not totally removed from history. There are at least glimpses in the past of such a possibility. In the 60s and 70s, for the first time, the establishment failed to produce national unity and patriotic fervor in a war. And this is me breaking in. When the shitlibs call for national unity, they want the people who are being given the shaft to shut the fuck up. That's what it means when people call for unity. That's what it means when they want to return to normalcy. They want to return to fucking the bottom half of the economy. Back to the story. There was a flood of cultural changes such as the country had never seen. In sex, family, personal relations, exactly those situations most difficult to control from the ordinary centers of power. And never before was there such a general withdrawal of confidence from so many elements of the political and economic system. In every period of history, people have found ways to help one another, even in the midst of a culture of competition and violence, if only for brief periods, to find joy in work, struggle, companionship, nature. The prospect is for times of turmoil, struggle, but also inspiration. There is a chance that such a movement could succeed in doing what the system itself has never done, bring about great change with little violence. This is possible because the more the 99% begin to see themselves as sharing needs, the more the guards and the prisoners see their common interest, the more the establishment becomes isolated and ineffectual. The elite's weapons, money, control of information, would be useless in the face of a determined population. The servants of the system would refuse to work to continue the old deadly order and would begin using their time, their space, the very things given them by the system to keep them quiet, to dismantle that system while creating a new one. The prisoners of the system will continue to rebel as before in ways that cannot be foreseen, at times that cannot be predicted. The new fact of our era is the chance that they may be joined by the guards. We readers and writers of books have been, for the most part, among the guards. If we understand that and act on it, not only will life be more satisfying right off, but our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren might possibly see a different and marvelous world.